So we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about density. First, we have to define what density is. Density is a measure of the amount of matter in 1 unit of volume. So the amount of matter is mass. So it's the mass per unit of volume. That means our units are going to be grams per milliliter or grams per centimeter cubed, because typically we look at volumes in milliliters or centimeters cubed, and we always use grams when we're talking about mass. So for example, if I have a substance that has a density of 2.7 grams per milliliter, that means my 2.7 grams will have a volume of 1 milliliter, or I can say that 1 milliliter will have a mass of 2.7 grams. If I look at another example, if I have 7.5 grams per centimeter cubed, that means that my 7.5 grams will have a volume of 1 centimeter cubed, or if I take 1 centimeter cubed and mass it, it's going to have a mass of 7.5 grams. So now we have to talk about how to find density. One of the ways to find density is simply to calculate it. If you know the mass and the volume, you can calculate density. So density is simply mass divided by volume. So say, for example, I have 10 grams of substance, and it has a volume of 5 milliliters. If I do mass divided by volume, which gets me 10 divided by 5, I end up with 2 grams per milliliter. So whatever this substance is, it has a density of 2 grams per milliliter, even though I have 10 grams of the substance and it has a volume of 5 milliliters. The density is 2 grams per milliliter. Another way that I can calculate density is from a slope of a line, and it's the slope of a line from a specific graph. If I have a graph of mass versus volume, and I plot my data and I get a line, the slope of this line, which is equal to rise over run, just like you calculate slope in math class, it's exactly the same. That slope is equal to the density. So if I have a graph, I can calculate the slope of the line, and that slope is the density of the substance. Another way that I can use this graph is to compare two substances. So I'm going to call this first line substance A, and let's pretend I have another line, and that's for substance B. Simply by looking at the two lines, I don't even have to calculate the slope. I can tell that since A has a greater slope, because it's a steeper line, it's going to have a greater density. The slope of A is bigger than the slope of B. Therefore, the density of A is bigger than the density of B. So I can calculate the slope of the line if I want to know the actual density, or I can just compare the two lines. And whichever line is steeper, it will have the greater density. So finally, we're going to talk about how we use density. One way that we can use density is to determine whether something will sink or float. So a substance with the greater density will sink. Say, for example, we have two liquids mixed together. And the liquids are different, they have different densities. The liquid with the greater density will be on the bottom of the container. The liquid with the lower density will be on the top of the container. So the one with the greater density will sink to the bottom. You can also look at this with a solid and a liquid. So let's say I have a piece of wood and a container of water. My water has a greater density than my wood, which means that the water will be on the bottom and the wood will float on top of the water. Since the wood has a lower density than the water, the wood will float. So you can use density to determine whether something will sink or float. You can also use density as a conversion factor. So if you don't have the means to actually measure the volume of a substance or to measure the mass of a substance, if you know its density, you can convert between mass and volume. So let's walk through two examples. So my first example says I have 25 grams of a substance. I want to know its volume, and I know its density is 3.4 grams per milliliter. So I'm going to use dimensional analysis to set this up. I'm going to start with what I know. I know that I have 25 grams. Then I'm going to set up my conversion factor. And I'm going to do my units first. Since I want my grams to go away, I'm going to put my grams on the bottom of my conversion factor. That way they'll cancel. And I'm going to put milliliters on the top because I want milliliters. I want the volume. Now I have to plug my numbers in. My density says that I have 3.4 grams per 1 milliliter. That means I have 1 milliliter of the substance and I have 3.4 grams. So I took my numbers straight from my density, but I kept them with the right units. My 3.4 stays with my grams, so my 3.4 is going to go on the bottom with my grams unit. My 1 is going to stay with my milliliters, so the 1 goes on the top with my milliliters units. Now I have to do the math, so I'm going to do 25 times 1. Milliliters are the units that are left, and then divided by 3.4. If I plug that into my calculator, so 25 times 1 divided by 3.4 gets me 7.4 milliliters. So I didn't even have to take 25 grams and find its volume. All I had to do was use the density to convert. So I know that whatever this substance is, if I have 25 grams, it's going to have a volume of 7.4 milliliters. Let's do one more example. I have 10 milliliters of a substance, and I want to know what its mass is without actually having to mass it. And the density of this substance is 4.8 grams per milliliter. So again, I'm going to use dimensional analysis to set this up. So I'm going to start with my 10 milliliters, because that's what I know. I'm going to set up my conversion factor. Since I want milliliters to go away, I'm going to put milliliters on the bottom. And then since I want grams, I'm going to put grams on the top. Now my milliliters will cancel. And now I need to figure out what numbers are going to go where. Well, my density says it's 4.8 grams per 1 milliliter. So my 1 is going to stay with my milliliters, so I'm going to put my 1 down here. My 4.8 is going to stay with my grams, so my 4.8 will go on the top. So now I'm going to do the math. So I'll do 10 times 4.8. Grams are my only units that are left, divided by 1. So if I do 10 times 4.8 divided by 1, I get 48 grams. So I didn't even have to mass out whatever the substance is. I didn't even have to physically have the substance. I know that if I have 10 milliliters of it, it's going to have a mass of 48 grams. So now we've talked about what density is, we've talked about how to find it or how to calculate it, and we've talked a little bit about how to use density.